In the golden heart of the ancient world, where the Nile nourished a civilization of gods and pharaohs, Egypt's glory was etched in stone and sunlight. We see the pyramids, the temples, the dazzling treasures. But hidden behind these grand facades, within the sacred walls themselves, lived a story the world was never meant to see. They were called the Hemet Netcher, the wives of the god. To the people, they were the chosen few, living embodiments of divine purity. To the priests, they were sacred vessels. But who were they really? Their story is a quiet, haunting journey into a world where faith and captivity were one and the same. It began not with a choice, but with a summons. Across the villages lining the Nile, the temples held immense power. They were centers of knowledge, wealth, and law. When a temple called for a daughter, families obeyed. It was considered the highest honor to dedicate a child to the gods, a sacrifice made out of piety, or sometimes out of necessity. But what that service truly meant, few ever knew. The chosen girls were brought to the great sanctuaries, vast halls filled with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting. There, their old lives vanished. They were given new names, names that tied them not to their families, but to the gods. Their pasts, their identities were folded away like a scroll sealed in a tomb. Their transformation was a series of sacred rituals. They were purified in water drawn from the Nile at dawn. They fasted under the rising sun, and they prayed in solitude. Each act was meant to wash away the world they knew. To outsiders, it was a beautiful, divine preparation. But for the girls, it was a slow unraveling of self, a separation from everything that made them human. They were told they now belonged to the divine. Their purpose was sacred, their every breath an offering. They were trained to move with the grace of a gazelle, to speak only in hymns, to live in a world of profound silence. Their laughter, their tears, their private thoughts, all were to be offered up to the heavens, never shared, never spoken aloud. Their days started with music. At sunrise, they gathered in temple courtyards, their bare feet cool on the stone as they sang to greet the dawn. They tended to the offerings, polished the statues of the gods, and prepared sacred spaces for prayer. Every action had meaning. Every movement carried weight. But the core of their duty was absolute obedience. To doubt was to sin. In the eyes of the temple, they were pure, flawless bridges between heaven and earth. The people looked at them with awe, believing they walked among the gods, draped in fine linen and gold. But behind the serene smiles and holy appearances, a different reality unfolded. The smiles belonged to duty, not joy. They could never see their families again. They could never leave the temple walls. Their world of eternal service was bounded not by stone, but by faith. The temple became their entire universe. Its vast corridors echoed with their chants, and flickering torchlight danced across painted walls. Their chambers were simple, filled with sacred symbols. They learned to forget their own reflections, as mirrors were forbidden. They learned to forget their birth names, for the gods had given them new ones. They learned to quiet their memories, because the past was no longer theirs to hold. Time blurred. Days turned into years. New maidens arrived, some wide-eyed with wonder, others trembling with fear. The elder ones would teach them the sacred ways, whispering the unwritten rules. Never question, never refuse, never remember who you once were. And the hardest rule of all, never expect the gods to speak back. Because the gods were silent. The statues stood unmoving, the altars remained cold. The maidens prayed and sang day after day, but the divine answers never came. Still they continued. It was their faith, or perhaps what their faith had become. Some found genuine peace in their service. They believed their devotion made Egypt prosper, that their purity brought the floods, grew the crops, and protected the kingdom. But others carried silent questions buried deep in their hearts, questions that no priest would ever answer. What if the divine never heard them? What if the gods they served were as lifeless as the stone they were carved from? When illness or age took its toll, a maiden might be led to the temple's lower chambers, quiet places of rest where only priests could enter. Her companions would leave small offerings at the door, whispering blessings. More often than not, she would never be seen again. Her service was declared complete, her name added to a sacred list. For generations, this cycle continued. To the world outside, these maidens were the pride of Egypt's faith, holy, pure, and eternal. But inside the temple, many lived lives of quiet endurance, bound not by chains, but by belief, a bond far harder to break. Yet even in that gilded cage, they found strength in each other. At night, when the torches dimmed and the chants faded, they would whisper gentle prayers not found in any scripture. Prayers for freedom, for remembrance, for the world beyond the temple walls. These whispers were their hidden rebellion, a way to keep their humanity alive. Centuries passed, and Egypt's great power began to wane. The temples fell silent, their old gods forgotten, their sanctuaries surrendered to sand and wind, but the stones held their secrets. When archaeologists uncovered these ruins, they found fragments of the maidens' world, delicate ornaments, faint inscriptions, and stories carved so small they were almost invisible. And among the hieroglyphs of praise, they found something else: strange personal marks, symbols of eyes, hands, and tears, secret messages from those who could not speak freely. One inscription read, "We were the chosen, yet unseen." Another, "Our silence was our offering." And in a faint corner, nearly erased by time, a final line survived: "Remember us not as divine, but as human." These words speak louder than the grandest temples. Behind every statue of a goddess stood a woman who gave her life to an ideal she could not question. Behind every hymn of devotion was a voice that learned to hide its pain behind prayer. Their story isn't one of cruelty, but of devotion taken to its deepest, most human limit, where belief becomes identity and freedom quietly fades into faith. History remembered the kings, the gods, and the monuments, but not the women who carried that sacred burden in silence. Their truth simply didn't fit the legend, but they were not forgotten. Even now, when the desert wind moves across the ruins of Thebes and Luxor, it carries a sound, faint, rhythmic, almost like a song. It's the echo of their voices rising once more. The wives of the god live on in the spaces between the hieroglyphs, in the sacred hush that falls when the sun sets over the Nile. Their silence was never emptiness. It was remembrance. It was survival. And through that silence, their story still speaks, a powerful testament to faith, endurance, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you found this story as moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more hidden histories. See you next time.